she raised a piece of consecrated bread at an army, and the soldiers fell backward off their ladders. She saw a Christmas Mass happening a mile away through solid stone while she couldn't leave her bed. She healed a dying boy with nothing but the sign of the cross. For 27 years, she could not stand on her own. Her name was Clare of Assisi, a nobleman's daughter from a small hill town in Italy who traded a wedding gown for a beggar's habit at 18 years old. She was the first and only woman Francis of Assisi ever accepted as a follower. She outlived him by 27 years. Years she spent almost entirely in one small room. She was too weak to walk. And yet, when soldiers scaled the walls of her convent, she was the only one who did not run. So who was this woman? And what happened the night an army came for her and left without a single word? This is Halos and Histories, stories the saints left behind. Assisi, Italy. The early 1200s. A stone palace near the Cathedral of San Rufino, its walls thick enough to keep out both winter and worry. Clare of Assisi was born into one of the wealthiest families in the city, her father a count, her mother Ortolana, a woman known for her piety and her long pilgrimages to Rome. By most accounts, Clare was born in 1193 or 1194. The exact year was never recorded with certainty. What was recorded, later by the people who watched her grow up, was something else entirely. A household servant named Giovanni di Ventura, pronounced Giovanni di Ventura, kept watch over the family home when Clare was 18. Years afterward, under oath, he testified that even then, dressed in the finest clothes her father's money could buy, Clare wore a rough garment underneath, hidden against her skin. She fasted quietly. She gave away food meant for her own table. Nobody in the household seemed to notice. Or if they noticed, nobody said anything. Then at 18, she heard a Lenten sermon by a man the whole city already considered either a saint or a fool. Francis, the merchant's son who had given away his father's cloth and his father's money to live as a beggar. Clare arranged to speak with him. In secret. More than once. What passed between them in those conversations was never fully recorded, but something in her shifted, quietly, the way a decision settles into a person long before anyone else can see it. Her family had already begun planning her marriage. It was what a girl of her station did. A good match, a good name, a life inside walls like the one she'd grown up in. On Palm Sunday, 12/12, Clare went to Mass at the cathedral with her family. When the bishop handed out palm branches to the congregation, everyone came forward to receive theirs. Everyone except Clare, who stayed in her seat. It was such a small thing. Nobody in the church that day would have thought twice about it, but the bishop noticed, walked to where she sat, and placed the branch in her hands himself. That night, Clare did not use the front door of her home. Every exit a young noblewoman might use was watched, guarded, expected. So she left through the one door no one thought to guard, the door reserved for carrying the dead out of the house, rarely opened, rarely noticed. She walked out into the dark alone, down through the streets of Assisi, toward a small chapel outside the city walls where Francis and his few followers were waiting. There, Francis cut off her hair with his own hands, long and by every account remarkably beautiful. It fell to the floor of the chapel, and with it went the life that had been planned for her since birth. She put on a plain, coarse habit, the kind worn by penitents, not princesses. Clare of Assisi was 18 years old, and she had just given away everything she was ever supposed to become. But leaving her father's house had been the easy part. Her family was not going to let her go without a fight. Word spread through Assisi quickly. The count's daughter was gone. Her uncle Monaldo, head of the household since her father's death, gathered a group of armed knights and rode first to the little chapel where Francis and his brothers lived. Clare wasn't there. She had already been moved for her own safety to a Benedictine convent nearby, one that held the right of sanctuary. a legal protection strong enough that even a furious uncle with armed men could not simply walk in and take her. Monaldo tried anyway. According to the earliest accounts of what happened next, he changed his approach, from threats to something gentler. He only wanted to see her, he said, to know she was safe. If she would meet him just once in the convent church, he and his men would leave in peace. Clare agreed, on the condition that the knights leave their weapons at the door. When they came inside, she did something that ended the argument before it began. She pulled back her veil and showed them her head. Shorn down to bare scalp, the golden hair every one of them remembered gone completely. In the eyes of the church, and increasingly in her own, this was no longer a runaway girl who could simply be walked home. She belonged to God now, in a way that even her family's knights understood they could not undo. Monaldo left without her, but the Offreduccio family was not finished being tested. 16 days later, Clare's younger sister, a 15-year-old named Catherine, slipped away from the same household to join her. Clare had been praying that her sister might one day choose this life too. She got her answer sooner than expected. Monaldo's fury this time had nowhere else to go. He rode again, this time with a larger company of men, to the convent where the sisters were now staying together. According to the account recorded in the following decades, he confronted the teenage girl directly, and when persuasion failed, drew his sword. What happened next was written down by witnesses who lived through it, and repeated for generations afterward. His arm went dead before the blow could land. The sword dropped from his hand. It did not stop the rest of the men. They dragged Catherine out of the building by her hair, striking her, kicking her, as she was pulled across the ground toward the horses. And then, according to the same early account, something in her simply refused to move any further. Her body, the record says, became too heavy to lift. The men who had easily dragged a 15-year-old girl across a courtyard could not carry her another step. They left her there, bruised but free. Francis gave her a new name that day, Agnes, after the girl martyr known for gentleness. She would keep it the rest of her life. Clare had won. Twice her family had come with force, and twice they had left empty-handed. It would be easy to call this the end of her trial by fire. It was only the beginning of a different kind, one that would last far longer and require far more patience than a single night of resistance ever could. The sisters settled at San Damiano, pronounced San Damiano, a small half-ruined chapel just outside Assisi's walls, the same one Francis himself had once repaired stone by stone after hearing a voice tell him, "Rebuild my church." It would remain Clare's home for the next 42 years. She would never leave it again. More women came. Clare's own mother, Ortolana, eventually joined her daughters there. Within a few years, Clare, barely into her 20s, was named abbess, though she never wanted the title and resisted it as long as she could. She would later write that she saw herself only as a servant to the others, not their superior. What made San Damiano different from every other convent in Europe was not the women who lived there. It was the rule they lived by. Religious communities of women in the 13th century did not write their own rules. That was simply not how the system worked. A bishop, a pope, a male order. Someone else decided how nuns should live, what they could own, how they should pray. Even communities founded by women were, in practice, governed by rules handed down from outside. Clare refused this from the start. She wanted her sisters to live exactly as Francis and his brothers lived, owning nothing, not even collectively, not even as an institution. No land, no income, no safety net beyond what was given to them each day by the people of Assisi. Church officials found this deeply uncomfortable. A community of cloistered women with zero material security was, to the men overseeing them, a kind of standing emergency. In 1219, Cardinal Ugolino, the same man who would later become Pope Gregory IX, drafted a modified rule for the sisters, one that allowed the convent to hold property collectively, the way every other order did. Clare refused to accept it. She did not shout. She did not stage a public protest. She simply held her ground. Year after year, argument after argument, until in 1228, now speaking with Gregory IX himself, the same cardinal who had once tried to soften her order's poverty, she won something almost no other religious community in Europe had: the privilege of poverty. A formal written guarantee that San Damiano would never be forced to own property, not even to survive. "They say that we are too poor," she is remembered to have said to those who questioned the wisdom of it. "But can a heart which possesses the infinite God be truly called poor?" It was not defiance for its own sake. It was the same conviction that had once sent her out through a door reserved for the dead. The belief that giving everything away was not a loss, but the only real form of freedom she had ever wanted. She spent the next several decades writing, refining, and defending a rule of life for her sisters. The first set of monastic guidelines in the recorded history of the Church known to have been composed by a woman. It would take until the very last days of her life to see it formally, permanently approved. But that struggle, and its startling conclusion, belongs to a much later chapter. For now, in the 1220s and 1230s, Clare governed her small community from San Damiano, wrote letters to women she would likely never meet in person, and quietly built a reputation that would soon reach far beyond the walls of Assisi. One of those letters would become some of the most tender writing to survive from her hand, addressed not to a fellow nun, but to a princess who had given up a throne. Around 1234, word reached San Damiano of a young woman in Bohemia, unlike anyone Clare had encountered before. Agnes of Prague was the daughter of a king, raised among the great royal houses of Europe. She had been promised in marriage more than once, to a duke, to the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, and finally to the emperor himself, Frederick II. It would have made her one of the most powerful women on the continent. Agnes refused all of it. She had heard of the small community of poor ladies that Clare had founded in Italy, women who owned nothing and depended entirely on what was given to them each day. Something in that radical poverty spoke to her more than any crown could. She gave away her wealth, founded a hospital for the poor in Prague, and asked to follow the same way of life Clare had chosen 20 years earlier. The two women would never meet in person. Not once, in the rest of their lives. Everything that passed between them passed through letters. 4 of them, written by Clare over the better part of 2 decades, carried across mountains and borders by messengers on foot and on horseback. They are, remarkably, still with us, word for word. In her first letter, Clare wrote to the woman who had just turned down an emperor, "I consider you a co-worker of God himself." Not a subordinate, not a student, a partner in the same work. As the correspondence continued across the years, Clare returned again and again to a single image, a mirror. In her 4th and final letter, written when she herself was aging and increasingly unwell, she told Agnes, "Gaze upon the mirror each day, O Queen and Spouse of Jesus Christ, and continually study your face within it. Look closely enough into that reflection," she wrote, "and what looks back is not vanity, but Christ himself, the mirror without cloud." It was an unusual thing for a 13th century abbess to write to a former princess. An invitation to see her own reflection not as something to be ashamed of, but as a place where the divine could actually be found. There is no record of doubt or bitterness in these letters, no sign that either woman regretted the crown or the wealth she had walked away from. What survives instead is something more startling. 2 women separated by hundreds of miles and a border neither would ever cross to see the other, building a friendship almost entirely out of ink and shared conviction. Agnes founded her own community in Prague, modeled directly on San Damiano. She wrote back to Clare with the same devotion, though far fewer of her letters have survived. What remains is enough to know this was not a one-sided correspondence between a teacher and a distant admirer. It was, as Clare herself insisted from the first letter onward, a partnership. They would go on writing to each other for the rest of Clare's life, through years that would bring San Damiano its greatest trial yet, and Clare a suffering that would never fully leave her. Somewhere around 1224, something in Clare's body began to fail her. The records from this period are frustratingly thin. This was, after all, a small, enclosed community of women whose daily lives were rarely written down for their own sake. What survives are fragments, gathered later by those who loved her. A wasting illness that came on gradually, then settled in and refused to leave. By her early 30s, Clare could no longer stand for long. Before long, she could not stand at all. She would spend the last 27 to 29 years of her life, accounts vary slightly on the exact count, largely confined to a bed inside San Damiano. For a woman who had once slipped out of her father's house in the dead of night and walked the streets of Assisi alone, this was its own kind of imprisonment. Only this one had no door to escape through. What is striking about the record from this period is not the suffering itself. It is how little Clare seems to have made of it. There is no surviving letter, no account from any of the sisters who lived alongside her, describing Clare complaining about her illness. Not once. The sisters who later testified under oath about her final years spoke instead of what she did from that bed, not what she endured in it. She continued to govern the community. Decisions about the convent's daily life, disputes among the sisters, correspondence with bishops and cardinals in Rome. All of it passed through a woman who could no longer walk to the chapel a few steps away. The sisters brought their concerns to her bedside instead. It became, in its own strange way, the true center of San Damiano. Not the altar, not the abbess's old chair, but a small room where a sick woman kept running a religious order through force of will alone. She kept the Blessed Sacrament reserved nearby, in a silver and ivory vessel just steps from where she lay. Close enough that even confined to bed, she could spend hours each day in prayer before it. One of her own writings from this period urges her sisters, "Gaze upon him, consider him, contemplate him as you desire to imitate him." It reads almost like an instruction she was giving herself, day after day, from a bed she could not leave. It was also during these years of illness that her reputation as a healer began to spread through the Umbrian Valley, outside Assisi's walls. Mothers started bringing sick children to the gates of San Damiano, hoping that the bedridden abbess everyone was now calling Madonna Chiara might make the sign of the cross over them. One story, recorded by those who witnessed it, involved a small boy from the nearby town of Spoleto, pronounced Spoleto, 3 or 4 years old, named Mattiolo. He had pushed a pebble up his nose, so deep it could not be removed, and the child was said to be in real danger. He was brought to Clare. She made the sign of the cross over his face. According to the account, the pebble fell out immediately, and the boy was fine. Inside her own community, one of the sisters, Benvenuta, had lived for 12 years with an open, infected wound beneath her arm that would not heal. She, too, is remembered to have been cured through Clare's touch and prayer. Clare herself remained sick for the rest of her life. She healed others, she did not heal herself. If this troubled her, she left no record of it. What she did leave behind from this period is proof that a body confined to one room does not have to mean a life confined to it. San Damiano was, by every surviving account, more tightly held together during these years of Clare's illness than at almost any other point in its history. But the deepest test of that hold, and the moment that would define how the rest of Italy remembered her, was still ahead. It would come not from illness, and not from her own family, but from an army standing at the convent gates. By 1240, Italy had become a battlefield between two of the most powerful men in Christendom. Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, had been excommunicated by the Pope years earlier, and the two men were now locked in open war across the Italian peninsula. To fight it, Frederick relied on something unusual for the time: regiments of mercenary soldiers, many of them Muslim troops from Sicily, paid to fight in an internal conflict between a Christian emperor and the church he had broken with. It was, even by the standards of the 13th century, a strange and uneasy alliance. Soldiers fighting not for their own faith, but for a paycheck in the middle of Italy. In September of that year, one of these companies advanced on Assisi, and the first thing standing between them and the city was a small, undefended convent on the outskirts of town, San Damiano. Inside, the sisters had no weapons, no soldiers of their own, and no walls built for anything but keeping the world quiet. When the mercenaries reached San Damiano and began scaling its outer wall, the women inside did the only thing they knew to do. They ran to Clare. She was, by this point, gravely ill, one of the worst stretches of her long illness by some accounts. She could not walk to the window on her own. She asked to be carried there instead. Clare had the Blessed Sacrament kept in a small vessel of silver and ivory near her bed, the same one she had spent years praying before from her sickbed. She had it brought to her, and as the soldiers climbed toward the cloister, she lifted it and held it toward the window facing them. "Lord," she is remembered to have prayed, "protect these sisters whom I cannot protect now." What happened next was recorded by Thomas of Celano, a contemporary of both Clare and Francis, in the earliest written account of her life, composed within a few years of her death, while people who had actually been there could still confirm or deny it. According to that record, the soldiers who moments earlier had been climbing the convent wall were suddenly seized with something like terror. They turned. They fled back over the same wall they had just scaled, abandoning the attack entirely. Not one sister was harmed. It is worth pausing on how unusual this story actually is, even within the long tradition of miracle accounts from this period. There was no weapon, no confrontation. Just a sick woman, unable to stand on her own, holding up a piece of consecrated bread. And armed men in the middle of a war deciding in that instant that this was not a fight worth finishing. There is a second detail from this same account, quieter than the first, and in some ways more telling. Several of the sisters later said they had heard a voice answer Clare's prayer, a voice that seemed to come from the direction of the sacrament itself, promising that they would always be kept safe. Clare's response to this was not to tell the story further. According to the record, she turned to the sisters who had heard it and gave them a sharp instruction. They were not to repeat what they had heard to anyone, for as long as she was alive. It is a strange thing, to silence your own miracle. Most people who believed they had witnessed the hand of God at work might have wanted it known, remembered, spoken of. Clare wanted the opposite. Whatever had happened at that window belonged, in her mind, to God, not to her own reputation. The attack on San Damiano would not be the last time Clare's faith was tested by an army outside her walls. Word of what had happened there spread quickly through Assisi, and less than a year later, the city itself would face the same danger, with no convent walls to slow the advance at all. Less than a year after the attack on San Damiano, the same war reached the walls of Assisi itself. Frederick II's forces returned to the region, and this time it was not a single convent under threat, but the entire city. According to a letter written decades later by Pope John Paul II, marking the 800th anniversary of Clare's birth, the city was besieged by troops under a commander named Vitale of Aversa, pronounced Vitale of Aversa. Assisi's own soldiers were not enough to hold the line. Clare, still confined to her bed at San Damiano just outside the city walls, did not take up arms. She had no arms to take up, and no strength to carry them if she had. What she did, according to the same account, was pray. Not once, briefly, the way a person might offer a quick word before moving on with their day, but with the same fixed, exhausting devotion she had spent nearly 2 decades directing toward a single silver vessel by her bed. The siege lifted. Assisi was spared a second time in less than a year, and both times the same bedridden woman at San Damiano was credited with turning the danger away. It would have been easy, after 2 such deliverances, for Clare's reputation to grow into something closer to legend than to life. The kind of story that gets bigger with each retelling until the real woman underneath disappears. In some ways, that is exactly what happened. Word of San Damiano's survival spread well beyond Assisi, and pilgrims and petitioners began arriving at the convent gates in greater numbers than before, hoping for a blessing, a healing, a word from the woman the whole valley now called Madonna Chiara. But inside the walls of San Damiano very little changed. Clare did not use what had happened to elevate herself. She continued running the daily life of a small, poor community from a sickbed, continued writing to Agnes in Prague, continued arguing, patiently, persistently, with a church hierarchy that still had not given her what she wanted most: formal, permanent approval of the rule of absolute poverty she had spent her whole adult life defending. That fight was not over. If anything, as Clare's health worsened through the 1240s, it became more urgent than ever. She was no longer a young woman who could simply wait out a slow negotiation with Rome. She understood, better than anyone around her, that time was no longer unlimited. What she could not have known was how close that fight would come to failing entirely, or how narrow the margin would be in the end between winning it and running out of time. Sometime in the last years of her life, the exact year was never recorded, Clare faced a small, ordinary kind of grief that had nothing to do with armies or emperors. It was Christmas Eve. Across Assisi, the midnight mass was about to begin in the great basilica of San Francesco, built to house the remains of the friend she had followed there as a teenager and had not seen alive in over a decade. Every year the whole valley gathered for it. Candlelight, chant, the whole city drawn into one building for a single night. Clare could not go. Her illness by this point made even the short distance impossible. She was left behind at San Damiano, alone in the dark, while the sisters who could still walk made their way toward the sound of bells she could faintly hear from her bed. According to the tradition later recorded by the church, what happened next was this. As the Mass began across the valley, Clare found herself somehow present for it anyway. She heard the hymns. She saw, as clearly as if she were standing in the basilica itself, the ceremony taking place, and was later able to describe details of it, including which friars had led parts of the liturgy, with an accuracy that unsettled those who heard her account the next morning. It is a strange kind of miracle to sit beside the drama of an army fleeing a monstrance. There is no danger in it, no rescue, no army turned back at the gate. It is simply a sick woman, alone in a dark room on the one night of the year built for togetherness, given something back that illness had taken from her. For 700 years, this quiet Christmas story remained a small, tender detail in the life of a medieval saint, the kind of thing included in a biography but rarely the reason anyone remembered her. Then, in 1958, a very different kind of story caught up with it. Pope Pius XII was searching for a patron for a new invention reshaping households across the world: the television. He wanted, in his own words, to give the new medium a heavenly safeguard. Someone who could watch over both the good and the harm a device capable of reaching into every home might do. He reached back 7 centuries, to a bedridden nun who had once seen and heard something happening far beyond the reach of her own eyes and ears, and declared Clare of Assisi the patron saint of television. It is, by any measure, one of the more improbable footnotes in the history of the saints. A woman who spent nearly 3 decades unable to leave a single room in Assisi, now watching in some sense over every screen in the modern world. She never could have imagined it. She had asked her sisters not to speak of the voice she heard at the convent window. She almost certainly would not have expected or wanted to become famous for anything at all. But there was one thing left that Clare had spent her entire adult life fighting for. Something far more important to her than any miracle, however strange or however far its story would eventually travel. And as her body continued to fail her through the summer of 1253, that fight was finally, unexpectedly, coming to a close. By the summer of 1253, everyone around Clare could see what she herself would not say aloud. She was dying. She had spent more than 40 years fighting for one specific thing, a rule of life for her sisters, written in her own words, formally and permanently approved by Rome, guaranteeing that San Damiano would never be forced to own property, never be absorbed into a wealthier, safer, more conventional kind of convent. Pope after pope had resisted it. Gregory IX had tried to soften it. Innocent IV, the reigning pope, had once proposed his own version of a rule for the sisters. Gentler, more practical, more like every other religious order in Europe. Clare had turned it down. A year earlier, in September 1252, Cardinal Rinaldo, pronounced Rinaldo, the church official responsible for overseeing the poor ladies, had approved her rule on the Pope's behalf. It was progress. It was not the thing she actually needed. A cardinal's approval could be revisited, revised, quietly set aside by whoever came after him. Clare wanted the Pope's own seal. Nothing less would make the rule permanent. That summer, the heat in Rome drove the papal court, as it did every year, north to the cooler hills around Perugia, pronounced Perugia. Close enough to Assisi that word of Clare's failing health reached them within days. Pope Innocent IV understood what the news meant. His nephew, Cardinal Rinaldo, traveled with him down from Perugia to see her. It is worth pausing on what this meant, in the world of the 13th century. This was the successor of St. Peter, leaving the comfort of the papal court in the heat of August to visit the sickbed of a woman who had spent her entire life refusing to compromise with him. He arrived at San Damiano and found the small room where the famous abbess of Assisi lay dying. According to the earliest accounts, she received him not with resentment for all the years of resistance between them, but with what one biographer described as utter respect and humble gratitude. He asked her what she wished for at the end. She did not ask for comfort or reassurance or absolution beyond what she had already received. She asked, one more time, for her rule. On August 9, 1253, the answer came. The papal bull known as Solet Annuaire arrived at San Damiano, carrying Innocent IV's own seal, the formal, final, permanent confirmation of the rule Clare had spent more than 4 decades defending. It was brought to her bedside and placed in her hands. 2 days later, on the morning of August 11, 1253, Clare of Assisi died. There is a version of this story that could be told as tragedy, a woman who won her life's greatest fight only to have no time left to enjoy the victory. But that is not how those closest to her seemed to understand it, in the accounts they left behind. The timing was not a cruelty. It was, if anything, the last piece falling into place. She had told her sisters for years that she would not leave them until the rule was secured. She kept that promise with 2 days to spare. It is difficult to find another example, in the long history of the Church, of a struggle this long resolved this close to the edge. A woman who negotiated with 3 popes across 4 decades, and received her answer only once there was almost no time left to receive it at all. What remained now was only the end itself, and the people who gathered around her in that final room, carrying with them a memory that reached all the way back to another deathbed, 27 years earlier, on the other side of Assisi. In the last hours of August 10th, 1253, San Damiano was not empty around her. Her sister Agnes had returned from Florence, called back weeks earlier as Clare's condition worsened, and now sat beside the bed she would not leave again. 3 of Francis's oldest companions were there too, Leo, Angelo, and Juniper, friars who had known him since the earliest days of the order, before there was anything resembling fame attached to either of their names. At Clare's request, they read aloud the Passion of Christ according to St. John. It was the same passage, read in the same way, that these same men had read to Francis himself as he lay dying 27 years earlier, a short distance away at the Porziuncola, the little chapel where he had once cut off the hair of an 18-year-old girl and changed the direction of her life completely. Before dawn on August 11th, Clare died. She was 59 years old. The wounds of San Damiano's siege were 13 years behind her by then. The seal on her rule was 2 days old, and the voice she had once silenced, the one only her sisters had heard, the one she had asked them never to repeat while she lived, was, for the first time, hers to let go of. What happened after her death moved with a speed almost unheard of in the 13th century. Within 2 months, Pope Innocent IV had ordered an investigation into her life opened for canonization. In late November of that same year, a bishop and his small commission spent 4 days at San Damiano, interviewing 15 of the sisters who had lived alongside her and 5 citizens of Assisi who had known her from the outside. Testimony given under oath, recorded and preserved. Less than 2 years after her death, Clare was declared a saint. Today, her remains rest beneath the altar of the Basilica of St. Clare in Assisi, a short walk from the basilica built for Francis. Pilgrims still make that same walk between the two churches. Brother Sun and Sister Moon, as they came to be called, close in death the way they had been close in life. 7 centuries later, the woman who once asked her sisters to say nothing about what they had witnessed is still being spoken of by the church she gave her life to. In 2025, a pope who had not yet been born when the last previous pope spoke of her stood before a crowd in Rome and called her simply a courageous girl who went against the tide. She had told Agnes of Prague, in the last of 4 letters written across nearly 20 years, to look into a mirror every day and study her own reflection. Not out of vanity, but because something greater than herself might be found there. It is difficult not to think of that image now, looking back at everything Clare's life turned out to reflect. A girl who slipped out through a door built for the dead, and a woman who, decades later, held up something small and fragile against an army, and was not the one who ended up afraid. What does it take to hold a household of vowed poverty together for 40 years, against the wishes of 3 popes, from a bed you cannot rise from on your own? If this story moved you, consider subscribing to Halos and Histories, new documentaries on the lives of the saints, released regularly. This is Halos and Histories, stories the saints left behind.